In this episode, we're joined by poet Dr. Julia Cohen. We talk about creative making and borax. We also dive into what titles we give ourselves that make us feel like we can dive into our work. Join us. Welcome to Social Objects, the podcast where we dive into the lives and shared stories of the objects we make, use, and cherish. Welcome to Social Objects. My name is Dr. Medill. Today we're joined with Dr. Julia Cohen. Julia, if you could introduce yourself to us briefly, that'd be a great place to start.
Sure. I'm Julia Cohen. What kind of introduction would be useful?
What do you do? What do you like?
I am a poet and a nonfiction writer. So I'm the author of 3 books of poetry and 1 collection of essays that will be coming out next year. I've been teaching composition, creative writing, and literature for 15 years. I got my PhD at DU in Denver and feel really lucky that I get to be back in Colorado teaching at REMCAD.
Love that. And for our audio listeners, can you describe the object you've brought today?
Yes, I realize that I picked an object that is slightly hard to describe. Okay, so what I am looking at and holding in my hand is a slab of birch tree. And then on top of the birch tree slab are 2 crystallized pieces of paper that are all bunched up. So imagine that you were really, in movies when they ever have a writer that's frustrated and they grab the piece of paper and they crunch it up and they throw it in the waste bin, and it never happens in real life, but it does happen in the movies. So imagine that sort of crunched up piece of paper. I have 2 of those on the birch slab that are covered in crystals, which were made from borax. So what the object really is, my wedding vow and my partner's wedding vow, the original one. So my partner, up until the minute we were getting married, was still making edits and red marker on his piece of paper. And so we have the original wedding vows that I took and I boiled in borax, which is a type of bleach, and definitely don't do at home without reading about making sure that you don't inhale any of the fumes from it. So I boiled our wedding vows. I let them sit in a pan for maybe 12 hours.
Mhm.
And then I took them out with a spatula and they crystallize as the boiling water cools down. And the paper, obviously, when you put paper in water, it tends to kind of open. And so I had to a couple times go back in and push it back into the shape I wanted it to be in with various spatulas, and then let it sit. And then you just let it sit untouched so that the crystals can form on it. So that is the object. It's the 2 wedding vows that are now crystallized, sitting on a birch slab. And this was a present to my partner for his birthday. We got married last July, and then his birthday was in September. And I had been thinking about how can we kind of keep a celebration of wedding ceremony and the words we exchanged with each other alive in our lives without having them so blatantly framed on the wall or something like that. And so this was sort of a way to kind of honor that moment, but also keep it a little hidden and secret, and to kind of turn it into something else.
Is that your first time creating a mixed media piece, or have you done that before with your writing?
I have not done this with my own writing, but about 10 years ago, I was invited to be on a panel for a conference, and the panel was called Divinatory Poetics, and which I did not know that much about, but many of my friends are much more kind of expert on this topic than me. But the idea was that we would all come to the panel with our own idea of how to lead the participants through a divinatory poetics exercise. And the person who was facilitating the panel kind of framed it in terms of I mean, just trying to think about this, like framed it in terms of uncertainty.
Hmm.
That like in the act of divination, there is all of this uncertainty and there is conversation, and there's no right way into the conversation. So I kind of took that framing, and for the panel presentation many years ago, the facilitator also pulled tarot cards for us. And I forget it. Yeah, I forgot the tarot cards I got. I think I got a priestess and um, let's see, and the devil. I got the high priestess and the devil.
Ooh.
Um, and one of them I think had to do with the number 15. And so I took one of my favorite books of poetry by Gertrude Stein, and I pulled out every 15th page of the book. And then I did a similar thing. I crumpled up those pages and boiled them in borax and made these crystallized objects with them. And the idea for the panel was that I would kind of talk my way through like being comfortable with uncertainty and being uncomfortable and excited about discovery, and how, I guess, kind of like the balance between disintegration and integration, because these objects do kind of dissolve and disintegrate over time depending on the environment they're in and how you take care of them. And so at the panel presentation, I gave them out. Like I had, it almost looked like I had like a Tupperware. It looked like I had brownies in them, but instead I actually had packed these like little crystallized paper objects of Gertrude Stein. And my hope was that at the end of the presentation, I would pass them out, and then participants could take them home with them, and they could figure out a way to make a poem or write a poem based on the object. And so like the crystals form, eccentrically. So there's some places of text that are completely covered over and you can't see the words at all. And then there's other places when I'm looking at the object in front of me where I can see certain words kind of coming through. And so the idea with participants would kind of have to figure out how they wanted to interact with the object. Like, did they want to keep it for 10 years and let it dissolve and sort of see what words emerged from the crystals as they fell off? Would they want to take the object and reboil it and extricate the paper when the crystals dissolved? Would they want to take like a little pick and hack at it and see what crystals? And so it was sort of thinking about like, how can you generate poetry from found and disrupted text, and where does that lead you in your own creation of something new? So that's where this idea came from. The object in front of me, that is our wedding vows, there's no intention to like redissolve them or hack at them or anything like that. But I liked the idea that they were both like visible and hidden at the same time. And yeah, I kind of just wanted to preserve that.
I like the act of crumpling too. Like that seems significant in terms of changing the form of I mean, so I'm so object based, but like from paper, the shape very flat to more texture and dimension. I think that's an interesting choice in terms of your artistic process, if I may use that language. Does the crumpling as an act signify anything consistently for you, or in those two different contexts, did it have a different purpose? Tell us about crumpling. And I love that word, and I'm going to keep
No
saying
one's no one's ever asked me that before. Tell me about crumpling.
it. Yep.
Well, you're right. If I hadn't crumpled them and I had just put the paper into the boiling water and the borax, the paper would have crystallized, but I just think it wouldn't have looked as interesting.
Hmm.
I really liked like when you crumple it, I do love the sound. Like I love the like crunching of the paper. I like mashing things together, and I like think of literature sometimes so esoterically, but really like you are holding it in your hands, right? It is a physical act. If you still read with if you still read with books as opposed to Kindles or on your phone, it is a really physical act. And so I like the idea of crumpling it. I like that it wasn't to me an act of destruction. It was also an act of creation because I knew it was going to lead to something else. I am someone that like when I read, I love to mark up the pages. I don't buy library books for that reason because I don't want to terrorize the librarians. And so I love to buy my books, and then I have, special stars and underlines, and I have all these like kind of personal meanings for me and how I kind of annotate reading for pleasure, just so I'm keeping track of important moments and kind of keeping my focus. And so I'm very much of like interact with the text physically. So ripping a page out though is like a different level that I don't normally do
Yeah.
to a book or to anything. But yeah, I love the act of crumpling. And then when they do crystallize, it just creates really interesting shapes. And yeah, I mean, I know this is a podcast so that the readers can't see, but it's almost like they crystallize almost into the form of like paper swans. Like there's something really beautiful. They really do take this other shape and hold that shape because they're floating in water. And then once the crystals are there, you can take them out and they keep that shape and they dry off. And when you take them out of the water at first, like it's really kind of almost dark and gray, but then they dry out within like 24 to 48 hours and become much lighter and whiter. And then the text, you can really see more like what's obfuscated by the crystals and what text pop through.
Wow, that's so I'm sitting here. Deep. Would you identify as an artist? Is that a title you would claim?
No, I would identify as like a poet and a writer. I think I've always doodled and I love making things with my hands and crafting things, but I wouldn't kind of claim that more official title. I think I'm more kind of like crafty and doodly, and that's really just like for pleasure and fun. And then I think when I think of like crafting essays and poems, that's much more, well, I think like what I would say, like that's what I specialize in. That's what my brain specializes in.
I think that's really interesting. One of the things I think about is people claiming, accepting, or having that title of artist, right, placed upon them. Art historians, we love to categorize and give people titles. So artist is a big thing. And one of the things I think about is if we were able to time travel, would some of these well-known people claim that title, right? Or is it something we've kind of placed on them? I also think it's interesting in terms of social circles. Artists can be something that people really admire in certain contexts, and then in other contexts it's kind of like, oh, you're like out there, you're like against the social norms. But if you're within the arts sector, it's artists are almost rarefied, like they're these magical animals that collectors want to have a piece of or institutions want to hold a bit of. So that's something I grapple with. And as you were describing your process, the funny thing is, and as I'm an art historian, I'm thinking, oh yeah, Julie's an artist. So it's interesting that you wouldn't claim that for yourself. But if I were to write about you, I would add that descriptor, just so you know, when I do that someday.
Yeah, I mean, I have a 3-year-old, and I think that has also kind of reframed like my ability to make art. Like I'm like, I can make art mostly like a 3-year-old does.
No.
And I really enjoy it on that level. I think I really love gardening too, and like shaping the landscape around my house is like really interesting to me, and taking care of that and tending to it and cultivating that. So I don't feel like gardener has the same impact in our culture as like artist, but in some ways, I actually think in the last couple years, like where I tend to look visually is outside my window at my garden, and cultivating that in a way that is visually engaging to everyone who walks by our house and to all of the people who come to sit outside and have a cup of tea. So I think in some weird way, like that's where my visual artistry has gone. And then I also just channel it into funny little projects with my daughter. But I do love like making tiny things and collecting tiny things. And there's definitely moments like where I take poems and I will kind of create spaces for them to exist. And there is like a whole genre of poetry collections called chapbooks, which I guess it would be like you have a collection of poetry and then you have a chapbook, and that would be the equivalent of like a novel to a novella. So chapbooks are it's like if you have a collection of poetry that often has 4 sections to a book, a chapbook would almost be like one of those sections. It would be maybe like 12 to 20 pages max. And often chapbooks are created much more do it yourself. So like there's small presses that sometimes it's just stapled, sometimes it's sewn, but it's much more hands-on, and it's often like a print run of 25 to 50, maybe 100 copies. And so I think I love I love that genre of writing, or like that genre of project making, because I think chapbooks are often much more cohesive than full-length books and much more often tighter. There's no fluff. It's like everything that should be there needs to be there to make it what it is. And then it's often either created by the author themselves or a small press that really loves that collection and does all of this sort of hands-on work to bring it to life. So I like that intersection of art making and poetry. And I try to find little moments like that in my my personal life. Like I often make my partner, like if I write a poem for him, I'll like kind of like create a living environment for it to be in, or I'll go to like an antique store and collect old postcards and then figure out ways to kind of make it into a tiny little book. So I do like make little things, but they're more to kind of hold the creative works themselves. They're maybe more vessels.
Oh my gosh, you're 100% an artist in my definition of it. I'm like sitting here, I have some fun facts for you that I'm going to share. Have you heard of Jean Arp?
I don't think so.
Okay, so you've heard of Dada and Surrealism, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so Jean Arp, in art history, we claim him as an artist, right? And one of the things that he did is he would tear paper up, like found paper scraps and put them on canvas, and he would drop the scraps of paper and text, glue them wherever they landed, and then he would create poems out of that chance process. So I think it's interesting. You're talking about your process, and I'm thinking, oh, like Arp, you guys would have been chilling and tearing up paper together and crumpling it and like reading these poems. So I think it's interesting, and I'm not sure how we can get into this intersection of, and maybe it is more so contemporary art. In terms of contemporary art, I don't know if you have thoughts on, as someone who identifies as a poet, if you have thoughts on artists who kind of claim all these different modalities as part of their art making and put it under the umbrella of artists. Like, you've studied to be a poet, you've cultivated these skills. How do you feel, or do you feel a type of way when people in their creative process will claim those aspects without necessarily having gone through the formal education, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think a formal education can be entirely useful. Obviously, I teach in art school, so I 100% stand behind that. But I also don't think, a formal education is necessary to be an artist or a
Mhm.
writer. I was calling myself a poet when I was in fifth or sixth grade.
Oh,
Um,
wow.
like, I am a poet. What do you want to be? I want to be a poet. I want to be a writer. I want to be a teacher.
Mhm.
I want to be an editor. I've always wanted to be that. And I think that like sometimes you claim those titles before they even really fit what you're
Mhm.
capable of, or maybe they only fit what you're capable of and haven't yet actually produced. But claiming them, I think sometimes gives you the confidence to lean into it in certain ways. So I think that that's actually I'm all for people using whatever titles make them
Mhm.
feel like they can dive into the work and collide up against multiple genres. I think that's really wonderful. And I think my life would have gone really differently if my parents had been like, oh, you're not a poet. You've only written two poems. Or why do you want to be a poet? That's not going to make you any money. But instead, they were super supportive and sent me to poetry camp. I went to poetry camp at Duke in high school.
Oh, wow.
And they helped me send my work out to journals so that I was a published writer before I went to college. And so I think sometimes actually claiming those titles, even at a really young age, can help you find other like-minded people and then help you gather the support you need to kind of keep going. I don't know if I really was a poet in sixth grade, but I did write, I wrote poetry and I cared about it. I
Mhm.
used to make my friends stay in from recess and sit in the library with me and write poems together. So, uh, thank God for loyal friends.
Shout out to loyal friends.
Yeah.
We made
Uh,
it.
yeah. But so, yeah, I mean, I think we're more critical of it in public or pop realm when we see like a famous singer try to act or a
Yeah.
famous actor try to put out an album, and it's sometimes it just seems like hubris and ego gets in the way. Oh, because I'm good at this, I can do that. And so I think at moments like that, it's good to kind of step back and really assess. But I feel like otherwise I'm all for embracing the collision of different genres and seeing what new things can be made because of it.
Do you have an archetype for a poet if you were to describe If you were to describe a poet to your 3-year-old daughter, what would they look like? How would they exist?
I call my daughter a poet. She writes poems. She's 3 years old and she's really excited. She loves reading books and she's really excited when she understands that what she says can be written down and preserved, just like it is for a book that she reads. And I think that's really meaningful to her. So when she starts spouting really random, interesting stuff, I always pause. You're writing a poem. Let me get a pen and I'll write this down. And so we actually have a collection of poems by her that's called Poems by a Young Poet. And it alternates between poems she's written and just like pictures of her. And she likes to have us read those poems out loud back to her because I think it validates the fact that she is an artist and she has created poetry and she is making things that other people can experience. So I think that's really important. But so is there an archetype that I have? I mean, I I studied and I love the modernist female poets, so like Gertrude Stein and Mina Loy and Marianne Moore. I have always had a particular soft spot for Gertrude Stein because I think she did position herself not just with the poets, but she's really famous for having these salons where it was Picasso and
Yep.
Matisse and all of these amazing other visual artists. And she would have these dinners and parties where everyone was coalescing and interacting and letting their creativity kind of infect each other. And so I think sometimes the most vital and most exciting eras of poetry are ones that coincide where poets were really good friends with and worked closely with visual artists. And I think vice versa, right? I think those moments of visual creativity and innovation often come from groups of people who are interacting with musicians and poets outside of their particular field of study. So I think that interaction is really important. So I don't know if it's like an archetypal poet, but I do love the idea of bringing people from different genres and backgrounds together and letting them interact and seeing sort of like what gestates and just being open-minded. And I do think that sometimes students and young artists feel like all they want to do is study their one particular field or focus, which is great. Like, the more expertise you can have in a particular thing that you are passionate about, all the better. But I do think that something kind of magical, I know that's not like an academic word, but I do think something kind of like magical happens when you let yourself really gravitate towards pillars of knowledge outside of your initial kind of passion or field of study. And I think that often comes through the people we let into our lives that can introduce us to other things. So just I think like keeping that openness, keeping that door open is really important to like growth as an artist, so that you're not doing the same thing over and over again. I think that our work evolves not just from being, in a interest focused vacuum, but by letting ourselves think about like, okay, so how does like my interest in gardening and the language I'm learning about the plants then affect, like the poetry? It's an interesting question about like kind of a poetry archetype, but I really do. I think it's like someone that like has an open invitation to other people to join them in an ongoing conversation about art and politics and philosophy, and has all of those different ideas sort of coming together fluidly. I think there's kind of like a magical osmosis that can happen there.
I totally agree. And I was giggling earlier because I'm looking at my questions and I was about to ask you, why do artists need to study poetry? And you must have mind linked with me. I was like, okay, we're going there. Um, I think in terms of the context of this specific podcast, though, for RimCAD students listening, do you have any, I don't know, additional comments or thoughts on like an animator or a game art student? Why should they study poetry or care about poetry? And I know that's kind of blunt, but you're saying these pillars and having this community of practice that might spark other ways of thinking. Is that the primary reason? Are there any other, concrete's not a great word, but any other concrete reasons or any other examples of why people game art? I always go to game art because it's so foreign to me. And I'll share that personally. Sometimes I struggle as an art historian, like what can I offer them? So from your perspective as a poet, if you could solve this for me as an art historian, what do we have to offer these students, right, who are so outside our respective fields of practice that we're being positioned to help cultivate some kind of professional practice, right? That's something I sit in a lot, and I have to sit with that discomfort of, uh-oh, like, am I a fraud?
Well, I mean, this is a really big, great question, Kat. I think that taking poetry classes or taking composition classes have a lot to offer. It's almost just like, where do I start? So I think that a lot of RimCAD students come to college really confident in the visual art that they're making, as they should be. They're incredibly talented, thoughtful, creative, innovative students, constantly, pretty much every day, blown away by the work that our students are creating at RemCAD, especially in the classes that align with their majors and their larger career goals. And then, of course, that brings us back to the classes that I teach, which are creative writing classes, literature classes, and composition classes. And I think that, you know, as much as our students may feel confident in how they communicate visually, we still live in a world with words. We're going to need to articulate ourselves outside of our visual representations constantly through the day, right? Whether that's like emailing your boss or your coworkers, or writing a project, or communicating your enthusiasm for something that one of your colleagues is working on. We use language, both written and orally, every day, right? I mean, like all the time, right? We're constantly talking, as much as we may also be texting quietly, you know, under our desks. And Gertrude Stein says, words have the liveliness of being constantly chosen. And I think that that's really important. And I always come back to that sentiment, because the words we choose matter and they impact each other, right? We impact each other emotionally, we impact each other intellectually. And all of our composition classes, our poetry classes, our fiction and writing classes, our literature classes are really oriented around just the value of paying attention to the precision of your language, and how much can be gained from really being aware of the words you choose and why you choose them, and the meanings that are truly conveyed with those sentiments. And so I think that we spend a lot of time texting short sentences and communicating with memes and emojis. And the flip side of that, I guess, is that sometimes I think we underestimate the importance of the meaning that comes from precision and completing our thoughts. And so a lot of these classes are, you know, I think the creative writing classes are about being inventive and creative and thinking about new ways to enter into and enliven language. And that's really exciting. And I think it's that same kind of energy that you would bring to a visual major at RemCAD, right? Like, how am I going to invigorate this field? How am I going to bring something new and innovative to it? And I think it's the same approach to language in the creative writing classes. And in the composition classes, it's more about like, how can I build my confidence and gain trust in myself to develop bigger ideas and bigger thoughts and support them precisely and fully. And I think that often we kind of undermine ourselves by cutting our ideas short or not doing that extra step to research and support our viewpoints. And these classes are really designed to say, like, hey, it's okay to be uncertain about an idea. It's okay to take a risk. It's okay to take the time you need to develop your idea or change your mind or have layers to your thinking. That these classes are not about having right or wrong answers. They're really about like collaborating with your peers and layering your thinking and being open to revision. And I think that's a really important space to have. For yourself, right? It's important to feel like, actually, I deserve this time to think through this idea. I deserve this time to rethink this idea. I deserve this time to look at the work I've already written and appreciate it, and then apply what I learned in class today because I've already grown, and to see where I can go with it. And I think in a world where like we're very reliant and dependent on like outside validation for likes on Instagram and likes on, if you're old school, Facebook or Twitter, and in a world where we can easily use AI to do the work for us, these educational spaces, which are also creative spaces, are really important to invest in yourself and the confidence you need to have like deep, complicated thoughts and live with some of the contradictions that come out of those. And I think that these classes are really important to like remind us that it's okay to live with contradiction, to live with complication, to give yourself time to sort through it on your own and with the collaboration of people that you hopefully learn to trust and rely on over the course of the term. So I don't actually remember what the question was, but I hope that that answers it.
You've sparked a new one, and this is geared towards, hopefully we have fellow RimCAD professors listening, or just professors in general. I agree with you, and I love this idea of education or educative spaces as creative spaces. Something I struggle with personally, and I think it's a symptom or a side effect of existing in the United States, where we're very driven by production, is for me, this idea of creative space requires time. And RimCAD, as an example, we have 8 weeks, right? From a professor's perspective, we have 8 weeks to get through a certain amount of context and content. We have 8 weeks to meet certain learning outcomes, right? So do you have any strategies or ideas on how people who are tasked with implementing or fostering these spaces, but also have a time constraint and also have to meet learning outcomes, any tips on how to balance that? Like, how can we be creative with this lack of time?
Oh, that is a good question. Um, how can we be creative with this lack of time? Well, I think it's tough. I mean, I think one of the exciting things about the 8 week term is that it moves so quickly and that there is like a really kind of, I think, exciting pace to it. I've taught at colleges that have like 16-week terms, and by the time you hit like 14 weeks, everyone is kind of exhausted and they've worn themselves out. So I guess this is just to say, like, I actually really enjoy the 8 week terms, but it is sort of also like a puzzle. It's like, how do we fit into all these different pieces? When I teach my intro to literature class, I teach a contemporary short fiction course. And the final project, I really enjoy seeing what students produce. So because I've taken composition classes and I trust that they know how to write, basic essays and they know how to do research, I can have a little more fun with the design of a final project. And so students in this literature class can take any of the short stories we've read over the course, pick whichever one resonates most with them, and then they have to create a playlist for that course. And that playlist has to a playlist for that story, not the course, for the story. And then they have to trace a theme through that story and pick out particular textual moments that relate to that theme. And then they identify songs that they want to pair with those textual moments that like enliven or help you engage the theme in a different way, or kind of see it through a different light, or maybe illuminate it in a way that it might have been passed over if the song hadn't been paired with it. And so
Wow.
while students and so many students at RemCAD love music, are musically talented,
Yeah.
so they bring all of this outside knowledge to the course and come up with like a playlist, usually just of 3 or 4 songs. And there is writing involved. So
Hmm.
they have to explain and connect what the theme and the song is that connects with that textual moment. And they have to write about these two things. So they kind of make liner notes for the playlist that analyze either musical elements of the song or lyrics in the song and then compare them to that textual moment. And then they also create a cover image for the playlist that relates to the story they chose. And then they do our glass class as sort of like a party and a final presentation where students show the cover image they've created. They play one of the songs and then read the text out loud and kind of walk us through why they made that pairing and choice and what that song brings to light. And so they're kind of finding their own way into actually doing an intertextual analysis, but it's not like a formal, you have to write a 10-page paper at the end of the term. It's like they get to bring their creativity and outside musical knowledge into this. And I think students also get to like know each other better because they're sharing, you know, the music that they love that connects to it. And what I really enjoy, even though we read so many stories, is when a handful of students will pick the same story, but they'll pick a radically different song. And so I think they get to learn from each other that way too, of like, okay, I was interpreting it this way, but your song makes me hear the same passage in a really different light. And then they come up with completely different cover images and they all just speak to each other in a really interesting way. So that final class with that presentation and that final project, I think is a fun way where they are meeting the learning outcomes. They're doing close reading, analysis, intertextual, analysis, and they're doing, you know, a presentation for the class, but it's all kind of embodied in an assignment that allows them to kind of show different sides of their personality and interests and educate me too. Like I always learn so much about the different musical like bands that they share, but also I feel like I always see the stories in a different light when they compare them to these songs that I may or may not have heard of or have thought to think about them in relation to each other. So I think things like that are fun ways where like you can meet the learning outcomes and you can be creative and students get to kind of show us more about themselves in the process.
I love that. And when we're done, I'm going to get that prompt from you and I'm going to put it in the description of this episode so people can try it themselves. And by people, I mean me, because I'm thinking of all these, I don't know, songs or like what kind of short story would I pair with it? And that is such a creative way to create that space, and not just like the process of it. I always go back to community, right? And I think, as you mentioned, students get to build that community through learning or a creative space. So I think kudos to you. That's such a good idea. I am also, since I have you captive, going to ask you a question based off of my own trauma in academia. And so, for context, in grad school, one of the pieces of feedback I was given that I thought was a compliment, but was not a compliment within the context of grad school, was that you write very lyrically. And I was like, oh my God, thank you. But that was not, then I got points deducted. And I was like, oh, that was a critique. Do you have a line for creative writing versus academic writing or academic voice? How do you find that line? And again, this is strictly just for myself because I really believe in a postmodern world, that informality that I associate with creative writing or that more playful tone is needed in academia. And I'm so over the professional, I don't know, persona we're supposed to have, or I don't know, maybe people are that professional or that like one might consider. But I've always connected with, when I think about connection and I think about my own interest in research, I've always connected more with that human element when someone can share from their perspective, like this is how I was feeling while I was doing this research, or this is how I did or did not fit within this community that I'm doing work with. What are your thoughts on academic versus creative writing?
I guess when I think of academic writing, I now, having taught for like 15 years, don't think about it so much as like an academic tone, which is I think how we often talk about it, like let's work on our academic tone. And I think I've sort of put that term to rest. And I think more about academic writing as the larger aim of giving ourselves the space on paper to develop our thinking in more consistent, cohesive ways. And so to me, it's more about like the academic writing is more about like the space and the context and the references that we allow ourselves to have as we build writing that's in intellectual conversation with other peers and faculty members. And what I tell students, because I think that so many students do enter the composition classroom like nervous and overwhelmed and worried that they don't know how to write, quote, academically.
Mhm.
And they've had bad high school experiences in English classes. And I always just try to remind students that like I'm not trying to like make them write differently from who they are. That what I'm trying to help them do is elevate the style that they already have and to just be precise and aware of it as they continue to develop it. So for me, every student is going to have their own, I guess, quote, academic tone or academic style, because it's going to be particular to who they are. So to me, it's about consistency and awareness and attention to detail and just sort of like the academic voice is more about the effort we put into thinking through our ideas and putting them down on paper and less about like the thuses and the therefores, right? Like to me, I want students to hand in assignments that sound like them, but it's a version of themselves, right? It's a version of themselves that they can feel confident in. I think particularly with like the rise of like AI generated work, you can see so clearly the work that's generated by AI. It like uses these sort of lists of three all the time. It uses big thematic categories in the sentences that they write, that it writes, that I don't know what you call it, AI, like it, them. And there's a formality and kind of a distance to the writing that lacks personality. And I think now what I really want from my students is for them to feel like they can put their personality into their writing, and it just happens to be in an academic setting. That's more about like what are they trying to achieve with their writing, not that they need to sound different from themselves to achieve a goal. I think that isn't the goal at all. The goal is for them to feel cohesively themselves as they write and to feel that they put a time and effort into it so that they are proud of what they wrote and they want to share that writing with other people. And that's the kind of like pride and agency and awareness that I hope that they would bring to any professional setting when they graduate. But like, whatever job they have after this, their bosses, their supervisors, their colleagues, they're going to want to see their personality in their writing as well, right? If you are an interesting person and you are hired because you have an interesting perspective and an interesting way of talking, whatever job you have next, they're going to want to see that embodied in your writing as well. They're not going to want this disconnect between a complete formal writing, some sort of alien formal writing that doesn't really connect with your personality and perspective. So I really think that writing space, it's like, yeah, you're taking your creativity and you're taking your style and your voice, and you're just figuring out a way to kind of amplify it in thoughtful and complicated and complex ways and just giving yourself space to do that.
Okay, so what I'm taking away from that, two things that we're all collectively agreeing now, you and I, all the listeners, me, I'm going to repeat that to myself, that academic tone is out. We need to let that go, or we can let that go. We can heal. And I love the idea of something you'd be proud to share when you frame it like that. That's a really approachable way to think about becoming or being academic, because that's something, again, I make all these episodes about me. That's something I struggle with, right? Like I'll write something to submit and I'm like, is this me? Does this sound like me? Is this how I would talk to somebody? And I do think traditionally in higher ed, my experience with some of my professors back in the day, there was this elitism or this sense of you're cultivating a character or an aspect of your identity where the use of language is used to kind of alienate other people. And I think about, we talk about this in some of my courses for museums specifically, that we have our students read an article by an art historian who uses all these jargony terms, right? Like excessively jargony. He could be way more direct in how he's communicating things. And I'm sure part of that is his authentic voice, but there was also this element of, for the arts, like language kind of became our way of validating our existence in relation to like the sciences, right? Like we're masters of language. We can use language in this way. You don't get it. Like we're in this academic club, right? And so as that starts to change, and from my perspective, specifically in museums, this idea of accessibility, and we think about language, and I think I was told to write any kind of text I wrote, it was for like a 6th or 7th grade reading level. And so I think about that too in terms of modeling having a voice, and an independent voice versus an institutional voice, and how that's shifting and what that means. I don't know what that means, but I do wonder sometimes if we don't create space to challenge people with our use of language in some institutions. I guess that's how I'll put it. So,
Yeah, I think that's important.
yeah. I don't know if you could solve that for me. The other thing, what was I going to say? Oh, I was, as you were talking, I was thinking, how ironic would it be? I'm manifesting things in this podcast as well, but how ironic would it be if eventually we have Grammarly as a sponsor? That's my, you think,
Don't you
babe?
dare.
Um, I have a couple more questions for you, and we are now pivoting into my realm of museums and manifesting still. I am going to eventually have an exhibition on RimCAD's campus with all these items we've talked about. So this episode, all the other episodes. With that in mind, if you were to have your object within a museum exhibition, what would your exhibition space look like? And would you have any kind of interaction or engagement activity for visitors? And what would it be?
Oh, this is a really good question that I am not at all prepared to answer. Um, what would the exhibition space be?
Wall color, lighting.
Okay, well, I do have my object just in my living room. So I think that I would just create a space like that because I think that's how it's supposed to be engaged. Like it's not, I think part of crystallizing the object and kind of obfuscating some of the text
Mhm.
was to kind of like in a sense, it's beautiful, but then on the other hand, it deformalizes from the vows themselves, right? It's not like this official, and these are these two people's wedding vows, and here they are framed on the wall, and you can see immediately how thoughtful they are and how much they care about each other, right? It's like you can't actually see much of anything. Even as someone that heard the vows and probably read through them one other time of my partners, like I really can barely make out any words on it. And so actually think I was just looking at my own and I couldn't even make out any of the words on it. So I think I would like a space where it's lower to the ground and people can walk around it and maybe like a turn, like maybe have it on like a little turntable so you can, because it's a circular birch slab, so that you could kind of look at it from the different angles and see what words might shine through and get a sense of like what is or isn't visible. But I mean, I think the experience of it is that like you're both invited into this moment, but then kind of like kept out a little bit. Like it is, you can't actually get to the vows without destroying the object itself. I think you would probably have to like reboil it and melt it down and then take out the paper if you actually wanted to like see what the vows were about. And we had a very tiny wedding. I mean, it was a really small chapel next to like the dog park that we go to almost every day. And the chapel, I didn't notice it for many months. Like that's how tiny it was. And it was right by the dog park I go to, and it's actually owned by Parks and Rec. Not like some larger institution. And it just had 4 pews or
Mhm.
rows.
Mhm.
So truly like it just fit our like, you know, like my brother's family and our parents, and then like our officiants, and like one other friend, and that was or 2 other friends, and that was it. And so yeah, I think not many people did get to hear those vows other than our immediate family. And that's who it was meant for. So I kind of like that this is a public object, but it also kind of retains its insularity to it. So anyways, I think having it on a little spinny thing, so you know people could easily like move it around and look at the different words and the different crystals, but also have like a cozy couch to sit on and do that is what I would picture it, because that's sort of how it's situated in our own house just for guests to see and interact with.
I'm thinking about your assignment you have students do. What kind of song or audio would you accompany or have accompany your object?
That's a good question. I might maybe have the playlist that we played at our like wedding party afterwards. Um, and just sort of like have, I'm sure it was probably like 40 songs or something like that, but just sort of have that kind of go on a loop or something like that, which was all very like upbeat, but sweet music that me and my partner both love. So I would probably have something like that so they could kind of be invited into the atmosphere that the actual music created.
I was hoping you'd have a borax station where people could dip things in borax, but I understand that's probably not feasible, but maybe. Maybe that's a
You can
one night,
you
the
can
opening night.
you can do many things in borax. I mean, I've made little creations where I've taken like I've cut an eggshell in half. I mean, as much as you can cut an eggshell in half. I've broken an eggshell into two parts,
Mhm.
more accurately, and then put like a little, you know, porcelain figurine, animal figurine inside of it, and then put that in borax. And I mean, you can put almost anything in boiling water in borax and it will crystallize as long as there's like sides and texture for the crystals to cling to. So that would definitely be fun. But it's a project where it's like you got to then come back the next day to see what you've created. And I like that waiting time. It's kind of a mystery and it's suspenseful. And when I made these, I was very nervous that I would like botch it, and then I would like ruin the only true copies of our wedding vows. And then I would have to like start over with newly printed out ones. And it would have felt like, I don't know, not as true.
Mhm.
But anyways, I love that idea too of people being able to make their own objects or just having a big pile of objects that have been boraxed and crystallized and people can take them home. Like they can leave the exhibit like with a piece and then figure out what they want to do with it.
Like a take one, leave one. You dip something, you take something that's been dipped.
Yeah.
Oh, I love that. Okay, two more questions. This is a big one. Why do you think people form attachments to objects?
Well, I feel like there's a lot written about this that I would not be able to like summarize in any good way myself on the spot. Um, but I mean, I think that, generally like objects hold, they hold memories for us. And so, I think that some people are drawn to certain objects because it's new and exciting. And then often the flip side because it's old and it has memories that are evoked for us. And that's a lot of what my house has. Like it has a lot of objects that have personal historical meaning to either me or my partner or our blended family. So I think for me, they spark memories that I might otherwise not be able to hold on to and keep as present. So I like looking at these objects throughout my house because they bring me back to other meaningful moments in time. I think like the same way that like listening to songs, I think it's a very similar thing. Like songs evoke particular memories and moments and feelings from our past. And I think objects work in a very similar way.
Do you think, or how do you think, or I'm not sure how to phrase this, but the conservation or preservation of material objects on an institutional level, do you think that's important to continue to do as we progress on this timeline that is human existence? Or do you think it could shift in a way? And this is the leading part, or I guess the part where I share context, right? A lot of museums are thinking about doing digital archiving, or museums are reducing collections or sending pieces back to countries of origin. Do you think institutions need to keep collecting, or can they chill, or advice for these large institutions that are collecting material culture?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like this is so far out of my expertise and knowledge base that I don't think I can like speak to it with any sort of authority, but like just on a very personal level, um, I mean, I do think that objects generally should be returned to their countries of origin if they were, particularly if they're taken in moments of distress or oppression.
Mhm.
I think that those are positive gestures towards like kind of like healing and returning objects to places from whence they came and not just claiming them as some sort of like thing to be inspected and othered. So I think that those steps are really important, but I do love having objects. Like I think that something is lost when things are digitized. We have all of our senses and we lose our ability to engage these objects sensorially when we can only see them two-dimensionally. I think like museums have certain smells and different rooms have different smells. And even if you're not allowed to touch various things, just getting up close to it and being able to examine it, you can kind of evoke the sensations you would otherwise be feeling with your fingertips if you were allowed to touch them. So I think that's important. And I don't know. I mean, when I was finishing graduate school at DU, they were just starting to digitize the library. And so they were turning the library into a social space and basically they were getting rid of the books. They were putting them in like giant trucks and hauling them off to a site far away. And you would have to order the books to have the books brought back to the library.
Oh,
So you would sort of look at like the digital library. And I think about it like this, like there are so many discoveries, intellectual and creative discoveries I made because I let myself wander through bookshelves.
yep.
And because I was looking for a certain book, but then I looked at the 10 books next to it, or I looked at the shelf below it, or a certain book caught my eye. And I think that there is a certain kind of spontaneity and creativity that is lost when we can't physically wander through spaces and find things ourselves. And I think that's lost when we digitize things. And I definitely felt like that. I had the experience of knowing the library as a library where all the books were, and then having to look for books online that were digitized. And it did the same thing. Like it gave you could visually see your book. Like it would almost give you the spine of your book and it would show you the books next to it on the bookshelf, but only a couple.
Huh.
And so it was very limited. It was almost like if you had gone into the library in the dark with a flashlight and then you could only see what the flashlight was shining on and everything else was blacked out. And that's what it felt like, as opposed to having all the lights on in the library and everything available to you, as long as you were willing to take the time to wander through it and experience it. So I guess I kind of think of it similar, the museum is similar to that library experience. And I've always loved going to museums. That was like a special treat that I kind of grew up in more rural, quieter area of Massachusetts, but my grandmother lived in Brooklyn, and she would always take me to the Met and MoMA, and these were magical. I loved going to the museums. It was completely magical to me, and she had an amazing knowledge of different like artistic time periods. And I lived like half a mile from a library in a town that didn't have much going on. So I was like allowed to bike to the library on my own. And I have very distinct childhood memories of curling up in different sections of the library or just spending hours combing through one YA shelf as a teenager, going back to my childhood book section and looking through those books and rereading them, and just being able to be there, being able to like be in a space to me is just such a different experience than having things digitized. So I'm always for like having a more interactive experience with objects and reading materials.
Preach. Your last question, and you can take a moment to look at your object, but if you had to define your object in one word, what would it be?
Oh, I saw that on your list of questions and I was like, I hope that Kat doesn't ask me this question. One word?
One word.
That's really hard.
I know. I'm here to ask the tough questions, Julia. If you don't know that by now.
Hard-hitting journalism.
That's what I mean.
Really breaking me down by your final question. I think I would say tender.
Okay. We'll leave it at that. Unless you want to expand, you don't have to.
I'll leave you with the mystery of tenderness.
I love that. Okay, well, thank you so much for your time. If you have anything you'd like to plug to listeners, feel free to do that now. Otherwise, I'm going to go do some lyrical writing.
Oh, you know, just the general, don't be afraid of our composition classes. Take our creative writing classes, take our literature classes at REMCAD. Um, it's just a place to be inventive and to have a little more space to figure out who you are.
All right, I'm signing up. Bye.
Bye.